Sometimes the most broken things are just waiting for someone to see their worth. In a small Montana ranch, everyone had given up on a wild stallion that no one could ride. They were ready to sell him cheap. Then a mountain man came down from the high country, took one look at that angry horse, and saw something nobody else could see. He climbed on that stallion's back while everyone watched. The horse fought hard, bucking and rearing with all his might. But the man stayed calm and steady. When it was over, he leaned down and whispered, "You're the one." Both the man and the horse had been alone for too long. What bond would form between two broken souls who had given up on the world? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Clearwater Ranch, stretching like fingers through the valley that had seen 3 generations of the Bradshaw family work its soil. Samuel Bradshaw stood at the kitchen window, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, watching the daily ritual unfold in the corrals below. At 63, his back carried the permanent curve of a man who'd spent his life bent over fence posts and hay bales. But his eyes still held the sharp clarity of someone who'd learned to read the land and its creatures with the precision of a lifetime. The ranch hands were already at work, their voices carrying across the morning air as they prepared for another day of breaking horses and mending what the Montana wilderness had a habit of tearing apart. Samuel had built this operation from nothing more than determination and a stubborn refusal to quit when the bank had foreclosed on his father's smaller spread 30 miles north. That was 40 years ago, when his hair was still brown and his dreams were bigger than his bank account. Now, the Clearwater Ranch stretched across 8,000 acres of some of the most beautiful and unforgiving country God had ever created. Rolling hills covered in prairie grass gave way to dense stands of pine and aspen, all of it backing up against the towering peaks of the Beartooth Mountains. It was the kind of place that either made you stronger or broke you completely, and Samuel had seen plenty of both over the years. His daughter, Emma, moved quietly through the kitchen behind him, preparing breakfast with the same methodical precision she'd inherited from her mother. At 38, she carried herself with the competent grace of a woman who'd never known any life but this one. Yet Samuel sometimes caught a distant look in her eyes that reminded him uncomfortably of her mother's restless spirit. Emma had stayed when her 2 brothers had left for college and never returned, choosing instead to plant their roots in cities where the ground stayed level and the weather stayed predictable. "That stallion's going to hurt someone," Emma said. Not looking up from the eggs she was scrambling. She didn't need to specify which horse she meant. Everyone on the ranch knew about the black stallion in the far corral. The one they'd bought 3 months ago from a desperate rancher in Wyoming who described him as spirited rather than what he actually was, dangerous. Samuel nodded slowly, his gaze finding the animal in question. Even from this distance, the horse's energy was palpable, a coiled tension that seemed to radiate outward like heat from a forge. They called him Thunder, though Samuel suspected that name was chosen more for hope than accuracy. Thunder suggested power under control, the manageable fury of a summer storm. This horse was something else entirely, a winter blizzard, beautiful and deadly and utterly indifferent to human ambition. "Jake thinks we should cut our losses," Emma continued, referring to the ranch's head trainer, a soft-spoken man in his 50s who'd gentled more horses than most people had ever seen. "Says he's never met an animal that didn't want to be partnered with. But this one might be the first." The kitchen fell quiet, except for the soft sizzle of eggs in the pan and the distant sound of horses moving in the paddocks. Samuel had been ranching long enough to know that every horse was different, like people that way, each one carrying its own history and hurts. Some came to you ready to work, grateful for steady feed and a warm barn. Others needed time and patience, gentle hands and soft voices, until they learned to trust again. But some carried wounds that went deeper than training could reach. Thunder fell into that last category. In 3 months, he'd injured 2 experienced handlers, destroyed 3 sets of tack, and turned the simple act of moving him from one corral to another into an operation that required 4 men and nerves of steel. The veterinarian who'd examined him could find no physical cause for his behavior. His previous owner had provided no useful history beyond muttering something about bad blood, and never should have bought him from that mountain man. It was those last words that had stuck with Samuel. Mountain man. In this part of Montana, that phrase carried weight, conjuring images of hermits and outlaws, men who'd chosen the high country because civilization hadn't suited them. Samuel had encountered a few over the years, trading for pelts or buying horses that had been captured wild rather than bred domestic. They were a different breed of human, shaped by solitude and seasons that could kill the unprepared. The sound of truck tires on gravel interrupted his thoughts. Through the window, he watched an old Ford pickup make its way down the ranch road, moving with the careful pace of someone who understood that haste and mountain roads didn't mix well. The truck was the color of rust and determination, held together by will and welding, the kind of vehicle that belonged to a man who fixed things himself because the nearest mechanic was 50 miles away. Samuel didn't recognize the truck, but something about it, the way it sat low on its springs as if carrying a heavy load, the careful way it navigated the ruts in the road, made him pay attention. Emma noticed it too, moving to the window to stand beside her father. The truck came to a stop in the circular drive in front of the house, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then the door opened with the particular creak of metal that had been opened and closed thousands of times, and a man stepped out. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with the kind of lean build that came from physical work rather than gyms. His hair was dark with threads of silver, longer than fashion dictated, but shorter than neglect would allow. He wore jeans that had been mended rather than replaced, boots that had walked serious miles, and a flannel shirt that hung open over a thermal Henley. There was something about the way he moved, economical, purposeful, like a man who'd learned not to waste energy on unnecessary motion. But it was his face that held Samuel's attention. It was a map of hard living, etched with lines that spoke of squinting into harsh sunlight and facing down weather that would send most people indoors. Yet there was something else there, a quality that Samuel recognized but couldn't quite name. It was the look of a man who'd been alone long enough to forget some of the rules of social interaction, but not so long that he'd forgotten why they mattered. "I'll go see what he needs," Samuel said, setting down his coffee cup. "Want me to come with you?" Emma asked, but Samuel shook his head. Something told him this conversation was better held one-on-one, at least initially. Samuel stepped out onto the porch, his boot heels clicking against the weathered boards. The morning air carried the scent of pine and hay, mixed with the ever-present undertone of horses and leather that defined ranch life. The stranger had moved to the back of his truck and was lowering the tailgate, revealing gear that looked like it belonged to someone who lived outdoors more than in. "Morning," Samuel called out, his voice carrying the cautious friendliness of a man who'd learned that visitors in ranch country could bring either opportunity or trouble, and you didn't know which until they opened their mouths. The stranger looked up, and Samuel found himself looking into eyes the color of winter sky, pale blue, with depths that suggested storms weathered and endured. "Morning," the man replied, his voice carrying the roughened edges of someone who didn't use it often. "Name's Thomas Whitehawk. Heard you might have a horse that's causing some trouble." Samuel felt his eyebrows rise slightly. News traveled fast in ranch country, but not usually that fast. Word gets around, I suppose. "Thomas Whitehawk, that name sounds familiar." "Might be. I've done some trading in these parts over the years. Horses mostly. Some folks know me from up in the high country." The pieces clicked into place in Samuel's mind. The mountain man. The previous owner's words came back to him now with new meaning. This was the man who'd originally sold Thunder to the Wyoming rancher, the first link in the chain that had brought the stallion to Clearwater Ranch. "You're the one who caught him," Samuel said, and it wasn't a question. Thomas nodded, closing the tailgate with a solid thunk. "Caught him, tried to gentle him, failed." Sold him to a man who promised he'd be patient with him. Heard that didn't work out either. No, it didn't. And now he's here. And we're about at the end of our rope with him too. Something shifted in Thomas's expression, a tightening around the eyes that spoke of old guilt and older regrets. I've been thinking about that horse for 3 years, wondering if I did right by him, selling him off when I couldn't break through to him. Been wondering if maybe I gave up too easy. Samuel studied the man before him, taking in the worn clothing, the careful way he held himself, the truck that had seen better decades. This wasn't a man with money to throw around or a fancy operation to return to. This was a man driven by something more complicated than profit. What is it you're proposing, exactly? Samuel asked. I'd like to try again. With your permission. I'll work for nothing, feed, board, whatever it costs to keep him. If I can't reach him in 30 days, I'll take him off your hands permanently. You won't have to worry about him hurting anyone or costing you any more money. It was a generous offer, almost too generous. Samuel had been ranching long enough to know that when someone offered something for nothing, they usually wanted something that couldn't be bought with money. And if you can reach him, what then? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving past Samuel toward the corrals, where the sound of horses moving in the morning sun created a familiar symphony of whinnies and hoofbeats. Then maybe we both get a second chance at something we thought was lost. The honesty in those words hit Samuel unexpectedly. He'd spent most of his adult life dealing with horse traders, cattle buyers, and ranch hands, men who measured their words carefully and rarely revealed more than necessary. Thomas Whitehawk spoke like a man who'd spent too much time alone with his thoughts to remember the value of keeping them to himself. Emma appeared on the porch behind Samuel, drawn by curiosity or concern. Thomas touched the brim of his hat in her direction, a gesture that belonged to an earlier generation, but didn't feel affected or false. "Ma'am," he said simply. "This is my daughter Emma," Samuel said. "Emma, this is Thomas Whitehawk. He's the one who originally caught Thunder." Emma's expression shifted as she processed this information. "The mountain man," she said, and there was no judgment in her voice, just a statement of fact. "Yes, ma'am. I understand that's caused some problems for your family. I'd like to try to fix that, if you'll let me." Samuel found himself wanting to say yes before he'd fully thought through the implications. There was something about Thomas Whitehawk that inspired a kind of trust that couldn't be explained by logic or experience. Maybe it was the directness of his speech, or the way he looked at you when he talked, as if your answer mattered more than his own comfort. Or maybe it was simply that Samuel recognized something of himself in the man, the stubborn refusal to give up on something others had written off as hopeless. 30 days. Samuel said finally. "Room and board, and you can use the old cabin behind the barn. It's not fancy, but it's weatherproof." Thomas's face didn't change, but something in his posture relaxed slightly. "That's more than fair. I appreciate the chance." As if summoned by their conversation, a sound erupted from the far corral, the distinctive sound of hooves striking wood with violent force, followed by the sharp crack of breaking boards. All three of them turned toward the sound, where they could see Thunder's dark form moving like a shadow made of fury. "You sure about this?" Emma asked quietly, her voice carrying the practical concern of someone who'd seen too many good intentions meet harsh realities. Thomas shouldered a worn canvas bag from the bed of his truck, the movement economical and practiced. "No, ma'am, I'm not sure at all. But sometimes the things we're not sure about are the only ones worth doing." He started walking toward the corral, where Thunder raged against his confinement, his boots crunching on the gravel with the steady rhythm of a man who'd made his decision and wouldn't be turning back. Samuel and Emma watched him go, neither speaking, both understanding that they were witnessing the beginning of something that would change everything or destroy what little remained of hope. The weathered leather bridle, hanging on the corral fence, seemed to catch the morning. Light as Thomas approached, its worn surface telling stories of partnerships built and trust earned. In a few moments it would either find new purpose or serve as a monument to another failed attempt at bridging the gap between wildness and civilization. Thunder stopped his assault on the fence, boards, and turned to face the approaching figure, his nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of something familiar yet different. In that moment of stillness, anything seemed possible. Thomas Whitehawk stood at the corral fence for nearly an hour before he made his first move, and that move wasn't toward Thunder at all. Instead, he walked the entire perimeter of the enclosure, his weathered hands running along the rails, examining the posts, studying the way the morning light fell across the space. Thunder watched him with the wary intensity of a wild creature that had learned to measure threat by the smallest details, the speed of movement, the direction of gaze, the tension in human shoulders. Samuel found himself drawn to watch from a distance, coffee cooling in his hands as he tried to understand what he was seeing. Most horse trainers approach the animal first, establishing dominance or attempting to build rapport through direct interaction. Thomas seemed more interested in the space itself, as if he were reading a story written in scratched earth and splintered wood. "He's destroyed 3 sets of fence boards in the past month," Samuel called out, crossing the yard to join Thomas at the corral. "I can see that," Thomas replied, without looking away from the horse. "But he hasn't tried to jump out." It was true, though Samuel hadn't consciously noticed it before. Thunder had battered the fence rails, kicked holes in the boards, and turned the gate latch into twisted metal, but he'd never attempted to escape. For a horse that clearly despised confinement, it was a curious thing. "What does that tell you?" Samuel asked. Thomas finally turned away from Thunder, his pale eyes thoughtful. "Tells me he's not trying to get away from something. He's trying to get to something, or someone." Before Samuel could ask what he meant, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention to the main road. Jake Morrison, the head trainer, was returning from the morning ride with 3 of the ranch hands and a string of horses they'd been working with in the high pastures. Jake was a compact man in his early 50s, built like a jockey, but with the patient temperament of someone who'd spent his life gentling animals that could kill him without meaning to. As the group approached the barn, Thunder's behavior changed dramatically. The stallion moved to the fence closest to the incoming horses, his head high and alert, nostrils flaring as he caught their scent. But it wasn't aggression in his posture. It was something else entirely. Recognition, perhaps, or longing. "He does that every time the other horses come back," Samuel observed. "Jake thinks it's territorial behavior, but it never seemed quite right to me." Thomas nodded slowly. "He's looking for his herd. Wild horses don't live alone if they can help it. This one's been isolated so long, he's forgotten how to communicate with his own kind." Jake had noticed their conversation and was walking over, leading his mount with the easy competence of someone who'd been working with horses since before he could properly walk. He was a good man and a skilled trainer, but Samuel could see the skepticism in his eyes as he took in Thomas's appearance. The worn clothing, the truck held together with determination, the weathered face that belonged to someone who lived outside the conventional world. "Jake Morrison," he said, extending a hand. "I understand you're here about Thunder, Thomas Whitehawk." "And yes, I am. Jake's been working with horses for 30 years, Samuel said, partly as introduction and partly as gentle warning. "He's never met one he couldn't reach. Until now," Jake added, with the honest admission of a man who'd learned that pride was a luxury he couldn't afford in his profession. "I'll be straight with you, Mr. Whitehawk. That horse is dangerous. Not mean exactly, but dangerous. There's a difference." Thomas's expression didn't change, but Samuel caught something in his eyes, a flicker of pain that was there and gone so quickly he might have imagined it. "I know the difference," Thomas said quietly. "Sometimes the dangerous ones are just the ones that have been hurt the most." It was then that Thunder made the decision. That would change everything. The stallion had been watching the conversation between the 3 men, his dark eyes moving from face to face as if he could understand the words being spoken about him. Suddenly, without warning, he moved to the corner of the corral closest to where they stood and did something none of them had ever seen him do before. He lowered his head and touched his muzzle to the top rail of the fence. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable to someone who didn't know horses. But to three men who'd spent their lives reading equine behavior, it was as clear as spoken words. It wasn't submission exactly, but it wasn't defiance either. It was something rarer and more fragile. It was a question. "Well, I'll be damned," Jake said softly. Thomas moved toward the fence with slow, deliberate steps, his boots making soft sounds in the dirt. Thunder's ears flicked forward, following his approach, but showing none of the tension that usually preceded his explosive outbursts. When Thomas reached the fence, he stopped about 3 feet away from where the horse stood. "Hello, Thunder," he said, his voice carrying across the morning air with surprising gentleness. "It's been a while." The horse's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His head came up, ears pricked forward with sharp attention. Then, in a movement that defied everything Samuel and Jake thought they knew about this animal, Thunder took a step closer to the fence. "Jesus," Jake breathed. "He knows you." "We have a history," Thomas confirmed, never taking his eyes off the horse. "Don't we, boy?" Thunder's response was to extend his neck toward Thomas. Not quite close enough to touch, but closer than he'd allowed any human to come in, the 3 months since arriving at Clearwater Ranch. The gesture was tentative, uncertain, like someone reaching toward something they wanted but didn't quite trust. Samuel found himself holding his breath, afraid that any sound might break whatever spell was being woven in that moment. He'd seen thousands of first meetings between horses and humans, but this felt different. This felt like a reunion. Thomas reached slowly into his jacket pocket and withdrew something, a small, carved piece of wood that looked like it had been handled smooth by years of human touch. He held it up where Thunder could see it, and the horse's nostrils flared as he caught its scent. "Remember this?" Thomas asked softly. "Cedar from that tree up by Crow's Nest Peak. You always liked the smell of it." Thunder's entire demeanor changed. The wariness didn't disappear entirely, but it was overlaid now with something else: curiosity, recognition, and perhaps the faintest beginning of trust. He moved closer to the fence, close enough now that if Thomas had reached out, he could have touched the horse's muzzle. But Thomas didn't reach out. Instead, he placed the carved cedar piece on the fence rail between them and took a step back. "I know I let you down before," he said, and though his voice remained quiet, there was something in it that made both Samuel and Jake understand they were hearing something deeply personal. "I know I gave up on you when you needed me most, but if you're willing to try again, so am I." Thunder studied the cedar carving for a long moment, then looked back at Thomas. The intelligence in the horse's eyes was remarkable, not the basic awareness that all horses possessed, but something deeper. Something that suggested he understood far more than most people gave animals credit for. Then Thunder did something that made Jake take an involuntary step backward. He nickered. It was a soft sound, barely audible, the kind of gentle vocalization that horses typically reserved for foals or beloved companions. In 3 months at Clearwater Ranch, Thunder had never made a sound beyond the occasional angry snort or the crash of his hooves against wood. Now he was speaking, and he was speaking to Thomas. "That settles it," Samuel said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "Jake, clear the south paddock. Mr. Whitehawk is going to need more space to work." Jake nodded, though Samuel could see questions and concerns warring in his expression. "You want me to help move him?" "No," Thomas said, still watching Thunder. "Give us until evening. We'll move when he's ready." It was a bold statement, considering that moving Thunder had previously required multiple men, careful planning, and a healthy dose of luck. But something in Thomas's voice suggested he knew things about this horse that the rest of them were only beginning to understand. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the ranch yard, the 4 figures remained frozen in tableau: 3 men and a horse, connected by invisible threads of hope, history, and the fragile possibility of redemption. The cedar carving sat on the fence rail between them, like a bridge spanning years of separation and misunderstanding. In the distance, the other horses grazed peacefully in their pastures, unaware that they were witnessing the beginning of something that would test every assumption about trust, forgiveness, and the bonds that could form between broken souls who had learned to survive alone. Thunder took another step closer to the fence, and Thomas smiled for the first time since his arrival at Clearwater Ranch. By evening, word had spread through the ranch like wildfire. Thomas Whitehawk had moved Thunder to the south paddock without rope, halter, or any of the usual equipment required for handling difficult horses. He'd simply opened the gate to Thunder's corral, walked away, and waited. After 20 minutes, the stallion had followed him. Emma stood at the kitchen window, watching Thomas set up camp in the small cabin behind the barn. He moved with the methodical efficiency of someone accustomed to making temporary spaces feel like home. A Coleman lantern cast golden light through the cabin's single window, and she could see him arranging his few possessions with careful precision. "He's been up there in the mountains alone for how long?" she asked her father, who was reviewing the day's paperwork at the kitchen table. "Jake says he's heard stories about him for 15 years, maybe more. They say he has a place up near the Continental Divide, lives off the land most of the year, comes down to trade horses and supplies when he needs to, then disappears again." Emma tried to imagine such a life. 15 years of winters that could kill the unprepared, summers brief and precious, seasons measured not by calendar dates, but by the behavior of wildlife and the color of leaves. What kind of man chooses? At that, Samuel looked up from his ledger, his reading glasses perched on his nose. The kind that's running from something or toward something, maybe both. Through the window, she watched Thomas emerge from the cabin carrying a battered guitar case. He sat on the small porch and opened it, revealing an instrument that had clearly seen as much hard living as its owner. The sound that drifted across the evening air was surprising, not the rough strumming she might have expected, but something more refined, more intentional. "He plays," she said, surprised. "Music's good company when you're alone," Samuel observed. "And he's been alone for a long time." The melody was unfamiliar, but hauntingly beautiful, the kind of tune that belonged to campfires and starlit nights. Emma found herself stepping out onto the porch to listen more clearly, her father following behind her. The music seemed to carry across the ranch like a gentle current, and she noticed that the horses in the nearby paddocks had moved closer to the fences, drawn by the sound. Thunder stood at the rail of his new enclosure, his dark silhouette perfectly still against the evening sky. His head was turned toward the music, ears pricked forward with obvious interest. It was the calmest Emma had ever seen him. "Look at that," Samuel murmured, pointing toward the south paddock. Thunder wasn't just listening to the music. As the melody continued, the stallion began to move, not the agitated pacing that characterized his usual behavior, but something else entirely. He was walking the perimeter of his paddock in slow, measured steps that seemed to match the rhythm of Thomas's guitar. "I've never seen anything like that," Emma said softly. The song ended, but Thomas didn't put the guitar away immediately. Instead, he looked across the yard toward Thunder's paddock, and even from this distance Emma could see the moment when their eyes met. Man and horse regarded each other across the evening shadows, two figures connected by some understanding that existed beyond the reach of ordinary communication. Thomas began another song, this one even softer than the first. It was then that Emma noticed the other change in Thunder's behavior. The horse had moved to the corner of his paddock closest to the cabin and was standing there quietly, his head lowered in what appeared to be a state of deep relaxation. "He's listening," she realized. "He's actually listening to the music." "More than listening," Samuel said. "He's remembering." The next morning brought the first real test of whatever fragile trust had been established the night before. Thomas appeared at Thunder's paddock just after sunrise, carrying nothing but the cedar carving and a length of soft rope that looked more like a suggestion than a restraint. Jake had positioned himself nearby, ostensibly checking on the other horses, but clearly ready to intervene if things went wrong. Emma found herself drawn to watch from the porch, her morning coffee growing cold in her hands as she observed Thomas's approach. Thunder was already waiting at the fence, and Emma was struck again by how different he looked when Thomas was around. Gone was the coiled aggression, the constant readiness for fight or flight. In its place was something that looked almost like anticipation. "Morning, Thunder," Thomas said, his voice carrying the same gentle cadence as his guitar the night before. "Ready to remember what we used to know about each other?" The horse's response was immediate, a soft nicker that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. Thomas smiled and held up the cedar carving, letting Thunder catch its scent before placing it on the fence rail between them. "That's from home," Thomas said quietly. "From the place where we first met. Do you remember that morning? You were with that little band of Mustangs up near Glacier Lake. Proud as anything and twice as stubborn." Thunder's ears flicked forward and he moved closer to the fence. This time, when Thomas slowly extended his hand, the horse didn't pull away. Instead, he stretched his neck forward until his muzzle was just inches from Thomas's palm. "Easy now," Thomas murmured. "We've got all the time in the world." The first touch was barely perceptible, Thunder's whiskers brushing against Thomas's fingertips like the touch of wind, but it was enough. Both man and horse seemed to exhale at the same moment, as if some long-held tension was finally beginning to release. Emma realized she'd been holding her breath and forced herself to breathe normally. Even from a distance, she could feel the significance of what she was witnessing. This wasn't just horse training, this was reconciliation. Thomas spent the next hour simply standing by the fence, occasionally speaking in low tones that Emma couldn't quite hear. Thunder remained close, sometimes touching his muzzle to Thomas's hand, sometimes just standing quietly in his presence. There was no urgency to the interaction, no sense that Thomas was pushing toward any particular goal. Jake wandered over to where Emma stood, his expression thoughtful. "In 30 years of training horses, I've never seen anything quite like this," he admitted. "Most of the time, working with a difficult horse is about establishing who's in charge. This looks more like they're having a conversation," Emma finished. "Exactly. Like they're working something out between them that the rest of us aren't privy to." As the morning progressed, Thomas gradually introduced new elements to their interaction. He opened the gate to Thunder's paddock and simply stood there, making no attempt to enter. Thunder approached the opening cautiously, sniffed the air around it, then retreated to the far side of the enclosure. "He's testing boundaries," Jake observed, "seeing if Thomas is going to force the issue." But Thomas didn't force anything. Instead, he closed the gate and moved away, settling himself on a nearby fence post to continue their quiet conversation. Thunder watched him for a long moment, then did something remarkable. He approached the gate on his own and stood there, looking out at Thomas with what appeared to be curiosity. "Well, I'll be damned," Jake said softly. "He wants out, but he wants it to be his choice." Thomas seemed to understand this instinctively. He approached the gate again, opened it, and then walked several steps away before settling down on the ground in a patch of morning sunlight. His message was clear. The gate was open, but there was no pressure, no demand. The choice was entirely Thunder's. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. Thunder remained near the open gate, occasionally looking out at Thomas, sometimes moving away to graze in his paddock. Thomas sat quietly in the sun, occasionally playing soft melodies on his guitar, but never pushing, never demanding. Then, just as Emma was beginning to wonder if they were witnessing a stalemate rather than progress, Thunder made his decision. With slow, cautious steps, he walked through the open gate and into the larger world beyond his confinement. Thomas didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even look directly at the horse. He simply continued to sit in the morning sun, playing gentle music, while Thunder took his first tentative steps toward freedom, and perhaps toward trust. 3 days passed in a rhythm that seemed to exist outside normal time. Thomas rose before dawn each morning, appearing at Thunder's paddock with the cedar carving and his guitar, content to spend hours in what appeared to be wordless communication. Thunder, meanwhile, grew increasingly comfortable with Thomas's presence, progressing from cautious approaches to actually leaving his paddock to graze nearby while Thomas played music or simply sat in contemplative silence. Emma found herself drawn to these morning sessions, often carrying her coffee to various vantage points around the ranch, where she could observe without intruding. She told herself she was monitoring the situation for her father's sake, ensuring that their unusual guest wasn't putting anyone in danger. But she knew that wasn't entirely true. There was something about Thomas Whitehawk that intrigued her, the way he seemed to exist completely in each moment, the gentle authority he exercised over his environment, the suggestion of stories hidden behind his weathered features. On the fourth morning, those stories began to emerge. She was replacing broken boards in the main corral when she overheard Thomas speaking to Thunder in his usual quiet tones. But this time, his words carried across the morning air with unusual clarity, and she found herself listening despite her better judgment. "I had a partner once," Thomas was saying, his voice carrying the reflective quality of someone speaking to themselves as much as to their audience. "A woman who understood wild things the way you and I do. She had a way with horses that made my efforts look clumsy by comparison." Thunder stood perfectly still, his ears pricked forward as if he were following every word. Emma set down her hammer and found herself doing the same. "Her name was Sarah," Thomas continued. "Sarah Crowfeather. She grew up on the reservation, learned horsemanship from her grandfather, who learned it from his grandfather, going back to when horses were still new to this country. She could gentle a wild mustang with nothing but patience and song, made it look like the most natural thing in the world." There was a long pause, during which Thomas absently stroked Thunder's neck, a gesture that would have been impossible just days before. The horse leaned into the touch, clearly enjoying the contact. "We had a place together up near Glacier Lake, not much more than a cabin and some corrals, but it was home. We'd capture mustangs in the spring, work with them through the summer, then find them good homes before the snow came. It was a good life, Thunder. The kind of life that makes a man think he knows what happiness looks like." Emma realized she was holding her breath, afraid that any sound might interrupt the story that was clearly difficult for Thomas to tell. Even the ranch seemed quieter, as if the land itself was listening. "But Sarah got sick," Thomas continued, his voice growing softer. "Something the doctors in Billings couldn't name, couldn't fix. She fought it for 2 years, stayed strong through seasons that would have broken lesser people. But in the end, he didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to." Thunder seemed to understand, moving closer to press his forehead against Thomas's chest in a gesture of comfort that brought unexpected tears to Emma's eyes. "After she passed, I couldn't stay at the cabin. Too many memories, too much emptiness. So I packed what I could carry and headed for the high country. Thought I was done with horses, done with people, done with anything that reminded me of what I'd lost. But then I found you," Thunder nickered softly, the sound barely audible but clearly meaningful to Thomas, who smiled sadly and resumed stroking the horse's neck. "You were with that little band of mustangs, remember? Young stallion, barely 3 years old, but already showing signs of the leader you'd become. I watched you for days before I made my move. Sarah would have said I was rushing things, but I was still angry then. Still thought I could force life to bend to my will through sheer determination." Emma thought she understood now why Thunder had been so difficult to handle. The horse hadn't just been separated from his herd. He'd been taken by a man who was grieving, angry, and probably not thinking clearly about the welfare of a frightened young animal. "I trapped you in Devil's Canyon," Thomas admitted, and there was genuine regret in his voice. "Used techniques Sarah had taught me, but without the patience and understanding she would have brought to the situation. You fought me every step of the way, and I fought back instead of listening to what you were trying to tell me." Thunder had grown very still, as if the memories Thomas was sharing were awakening corresponding memories in his own mind. Emma could see the tension in his posture, the way his ears flicked back and forth between alertness and anxiety. "I kept you for 6 months, Thomas continued. 6 months of both of us getting more frustrated and more hurt. I thought I was training you, but really I was just taking my anger out on you. When that rancher from Wyoming offered to buy you, I told myself I was doing right by you, giving you a chance with someone who might be more patient, more skilled. The admission hung in the morning air like a challenge. Emma could see Jake approaching from the barn, drawn by the unusual stillness of the usually active ranch yard. But Thomas seemed oblivious to his audience, focused entirely on the horse standing quietly beside him. "But I was really just giving up," Thomas said finally. "Running away from another responsibility, another chance to fail someone who needed me. Sarah would have been disappointed in me, Thunder. She believed that when you take responsibility for a wild creature, you see it through to the end, no matter how difficult it gets." Thunder turned to look directly at Thomas, and Emma was struck by the intelligence in the horse's dark eyes. It was as if he understood not just the words, but the deeper meaning behind them. The apology, the acknowledgement of failure, the request for a second chance. "That's why I'm here," Thomas said quietly. "Not just to train you, but to make amends. To both of us. We both got hurt back then, Thunder. We both learned some hard lessons about trust and disappointment. But maybe we can learn some better lessons together this time." Jake had arrived close enough to hear the last part of Thomas's speech, and Emma could see the shift in his expression as he began to understand the deeper complexity of the situation. This wasn't just about horse training. This was about redemption, forgiveness, and the possibility that broken things could be made whole again. Thomas reached into his pocket and withdrew the cedar carving, holding it where Thunder could see and smell it. "This is from the tree by our cabin," he said. "Sarah carved it during one of her good days, when the sickness was quiet and she could still work with her hands. She said it was for luck, but I think she knew it would become something more. A reminder that some bonds survive even death, even disappointment, even years of separation." He placed the carving on Thunder's halter, not the rough rope contraption that had been used to restrain him, but a soft leather halter that Thomas had crafted during the quiet evening hours. Thunder accepted it without resistance, standing calmly as Thomas adjusted the straps with gentle efficiency. "There," Thomas said softly. "Now we match, both of us carrying reminders of what we've lost, but also what we might find again." Emma realized that her hammer had fallen from nerveless fingers sometime during Thomas's story. Jake was standing perfectly still beside her, his expression thoughtful and somewhat amazed. Around them, the ranch continued its daily rhythms, but something fundamental had shifted in that moment of honest communication between a man and a horse. Thunder, wearing his new halter with dignity, followed Thomas toward the main corral, where the serious work of rebuilding trust would truly begin. 3 days passed in a rhythm that seemed to exist outside normal time. Thomas rose before dawn each morning, appearing at Thunder's paddock with the cedar carving and his guitar, content to spend hours in what appeared to be wordless communication. Thunder, meanwhile, grew increasingly comfortable with Thomas's presence, progressing from cautious approaches to actually leaving his paddock to graze nearby, while Thomas played music or simply sat in contemplative silence. Emma found herself drawn to these morning sessions, often carrying her coffee to various vantage points around the ranch where she could observe without intruding. She told herself she was monitoring the situation for her father's sake, ensuring that their unusual guest wasn't putting anyone in danger. But she knew that wasn't entirely true. There was something about Thomas Whitehawk that intrigued her, the way he seemed to exist completely in each moment, the gentle authority he exercised over his environment, the suggestion of stories hidden behind his weathered features. On the 4th morning, those stories began to emerge. She was replacing broken boards in the main corral when she overheard Thomas speaking to Thunder in his usual quiet tones. But this time, his words carried across the morning air with unusual clarity, and she found herself listening despite her better judgment. "I had a partner once," Thomas was saying, his voice carrying the reflective quality of someone speaking to themselves as much as to their audience. "A woman who understood wild things the way you and I do. She had a way with horses that made my efforts look clumsy by comparison." Thunder stood perfectly still, his ears pricked forward as if he were following every word. Emma set down her hammer and found herself doing the same. Her name was Sarah, Thomas continued. Sarah Crowfeather. She grew up on the reservation, learned horsemanship from her grandfather, who learned it from his grandfather, going back to when horses were still new to this country. She could gentle a wild mustang with nothing but patience and song, made it look like the most natural thing in the world. There was a long pause, during which Thomas absently stroked Thunder's neck, a gesture that would have been impossible just days before. The horse leaned into the touch, clearly enjoying the contact. We had a place together, up near Glacier Lake. Not much more than a cabin and some corrals, but it was home. We'd capture mustangs in the spring, work with them through the summer, then find them good homes before the snow came. It was a good life, Thunder. The kind of life that makes a man think he knows what happiness looks like. Emma realized she was holding her breath, afraid that any sound might interrupt the story that was clearly difficult for Thomas to tell. Even the ranch seemed quieter, as if the land itself was listening. But Sarah got sick, Thomas continued, his voice growing softer. Something the doctors in Billings couldn't name, couldn't fix. She fought it for 2 years, stayed strong through seasons that would have broken lesser people. But in the end, he didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. Thunder seemed to understand, moving closer to press his forehead against Thomas's chest in a gesture of comfort that brought unexpected tears to Emma's eyes. After she passed, I couldn't stay at the cabin. Too many memories, too much emptiness. So I packed what I could carry and headed for the high country. Thought I was done with horses, done with people, done with anything that reminded me of what I'd lost. But then I found you, Thunder nickered softly. The sound barely audible but clearly meaningful to Thomas, who smiled sadly and resumed stroking the horse's neck. You were with that little band of mustangs, remember? Young stallion, barely 3 years old, but already showing signs of the leader you'd become. I watched you for days before I made my move. Sarah would have said I was rushing things, but I was still angry then. Still thought I could force life to bend to my will through sheer determination. Emma thought she understood now why Thunder had been so difficult to handle. The horse hadn't just been separated from his herd. He'd been taken by a man who was grieving, angry, and probably not thinking clearly about the welfare of a frightened young animal. I trapped you in Devil's Canyon, Thomas admitted, and there was genuine regret in his voice. Used techniques Sarah had taught me, but without the patience and understanding she would have brought to the situation. You fought me every step of the way, and I fought back instead of listening to what you were trying to tell me. Thunder had grown very still, as if the memories Thomas was sharing were awakening corresponding memories in his own mind. Emma could see the tension in his posture, the way his ears flicked back and forth between alertness and anxiety. I kept you for 6 months, Thomas continued. 6 months of both of us getting more frustrated and more hurt. I thought I was training you, but really I was just taking my anger out on you. When that rancher from Wyoming offered to buy you, I told myself I was doing right by you, giving you a chance with someone who might be more patient, more skilled. The admission hung in the morning air like a challenge. Emma could see Jake approaching from the barn, drawn by the unusual stillness of the usually active ranch yard. But Thomas seemed oblivious to his audience, focused entirely on the horse standing quietly beside him. But I was really just giving up, Thomas said finally. Running away from another responsibility, another chance to fail someone who needed me. Sarah would have been disappointed in me, Thunder. She believed that when you take responsibility for a wild creature, you see it through to the end, no matter how difficult it gets. Thunder turned to look directly at Thomas, and Emma was struck by the intelligence in the horse's dark eyes. It was as if he understood not just the words, but the deeper meaning behind them. The apology, the acknowledgement of failure, the request for a second chance. That's why I'm here, Thomas said quietly. Not just to train you, but to make amends. To both of us. We both got hurt back then, Thunder. We both learned some hard lessons about trust and disappointment. But maybe we can learn some better lessons together this time. Jake had arrived close enough to hear the last part of Thomas's speech. and Emma could see the shift in his expression as he began to understand the deeper complexity of the situation. This wasn't just about horse training. This was about redemption, forgiveness, and the possibility that broken things could be made whole again. Thomas reached into his pocket and withdrew the cedar carving, holding it where Thunder could see and smell it. "This is from the tree by our cabin," he said. "Sarah carved it during one of her good days, when the sickness was quiet and she could still work with her hands. She said it was for luck, but I think she knew it would become something more. A reminder that some bonds survive even death, even disappointment, even years of separation." He placed the carving on Thunder's halter, not the rough rope contraption that had been used to restrain him, but a soft leather halter that Thomas had crafted during the quiet evening hours. Thunder accepted it without resistance, standing calmly as Thomas adjusted the straps with gentle efficiency. "There," Thomas said softly. "Now we match, both of us carrying reminders of what we've lost, but also what we might find again." Emma realized that her hammer had fallen from nerveless fingers sometime during Thomas's story. Jake was standing perfectly still beside her, his expression thoughtful and somewhat amazed. Around them, the ranch continued its daily rhythms. But something fundamental had shifted in that moment of honest communication between a man and a horse. Thunder, wearing his new halter with dignity, followed Thomas toward the main corral, where the serious work of rebuilding trust would truly begin. The second week brought challenges that tested every assumption about progress and healing. Thomas had introduced a saddle to Thunder, not the heavy Western equipment typical of ranch work, but a smaller, lighter saddle that looked handmade, its leather worn soft by years of use. Emma had watched from the barn as Thomas showed it to Thunder, letting the horse examine it thoroughly before placing it gently on his back. Thunder's reaction was immediate and explosive. The stallion erupted into a fury that reminded everyone watching why they'd been afraid of him in the first place. He bucked, reared, and spun in circles, trying to dislodge the offending object from his back. But Thomas didn't retreat or remove the saddle immediately. Instead, he stood at a safe distance and began to sing. It was a song Emma had never heard before, low and rhythmic, with words in what she assumed was a native language. The melody seemed to rise and fall like wind through pine trees, and gradually, impossibly, Thunder's violent movements began to slow. "That's a crow lullaby," Jake said quietly, appearing beside Emma as they watched from the barn doorway. "My grandmother used to sing it to the horses when I was small. Haven't heard it in 40 years. How do you know Thomas knows it?" Emma asked. "Sarah Crow Feather," Jake replied. "Her family and mine go back generations on the reservation. She would have taught him the old songs, the ones that speak to the animal spirits." Thunder had stopped his frantic bucking and was standing in the center of the corral, sides heaving, but no longer fighting the saddle. Thomas continued to sing, his voice carrying across the morning air with hypnotic effect. Slowly, carefully, he approached the trembling horse. "Easy, Thunder," he said when the song ended. "It's just leather and wood. Nothing that can hurt you, but I understand why it frightens you." Emma found herself moving closer to the corral fence, drawn by the intensity of the moment. Thomas was now standing directly beside Thunder, his hand resting lightly on the horse's neck. The saddle still in place, but no longer the source of violent resistance. "The last time you wore a saddle, you were fighting for your freedom," Thomas continued in his quiet conversational tone, "fighting against ropes and spurs and the weight of someone who didn't understand what you needed. But this saddle is different, Thunder. This saddle belonged to Sarah." Emma felt her breath catch. Even Jake, standing beside her, made a soft sound of surprise. She was smaller than me, lighter. When she rode, it was like watching water flow downhill, natural, effortless, beautiful. She made this saddle herself from leather we traded for, shaped it with her own hands to fit both horse and rider perfectly. It's never been used to force or dominate, only to create partnership. Thunder turned his head to look at Thomas, his dark eyes still showing traces of fear but also curiosity. Thomas reached into the saddlebags and withdrew something, a small bundle wrapped in soft cloth. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing what appeared to be a collection of braided sweetgrass and sage, bound together with sinew. "Sarah blessed this saddle before she died," Thomas said, holding the bundle where Thunder could smell it. "She said it would bring peace to any horse that wore it, and partnership to any rider who used it with respect. I've been carrying it for 3 years, waiting for the right horse to share it with." Thunder's nostrils flared as he caught the scent of the sacred bundle, and Emma could see his entire body relax. The connection between scent and memory was powerful in horses, she knew, and whatever memories this particular combination evoked seemed to be good ones. Thomas spent the next hour simply walking around the corral with Thunder, both of them moving slowly to allow the horse to become accustomed to the weight and feel of the saddle. There was no hurry, no sense of impatience. This was about trust, not training, and trust couldn't be rushed. As the days progressed, Emma found herself increasingly drawn into the orbit of Thomas's quiet world. She began timing her chores to coincide with his training sessions, ostensibly to help with ranch safety, but really to observe the gradual transformation taking place in both man and horse. Thomas had accepted her presence with the same calm acceptance he showed everything else, occasionally answering her questions about his techniques, but never seeming to mind her silent observation. There was something deeply peaceful about watching him work. No raised voices, no harsh corrections, just patient repetition and gentle encouragement. On Thursday of that second week, she was cleaning bridles in the tack room when Thomas appeared in the doorway. It was the first time he'd sought her out directly, and she felt an unexpected flutter of nervousness. "Miss Bradshaw," he said formally, "I wonder if you might have a few minutes to help me with something." "Of course. What do you need?" "I'd like Thunder to get used to different voices, different people around him. He's comfortable with me now, but eventually he'll need to trust others as well. I thought perhaps you might be willing to spend some time near the corral while I work with him." It was a simple request, but Emma sensed there was more to it. Thomas could have asked Jake or any of the ranch hands to provide that kind of exposure. The fact that he'd asked her specifically felt significant, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. "I'd be happy to help," she said. "What would you like me to do?" "Just be present. Sit nearby, maybe read a book or do some quiet work. Let him get used to the idea that you're part of his world now." That afternoon, Emma positioned herself on a hay bale about 20 feet from Thunder's corral with a book she'd been meaning to finish for months. Thomas was working with Thunder on ground exercises, teaching him to move left and right in response to gentle pressure, to stand still while being touched all over his body, to accept having his feet handled. At first, Thunder was clearly aware of her presence, his ears flicking toward her whenever she moved or turned a page. But gradually, as Thomas's quiet voice continued its steady stream of encouragement and instruction, the horse began to relax. By the end of the session, he seemed to have accepted Emma as part of the natural landscape of his world. "He's a fast learner when he trusts the teacher," Emma observed as Thomas removed Thunder's halter for the day. "Trust is everything with horses like him," Thomas replied. "They've been hurt before, so they test every new situation for signs of danger. But once they decide you're safe, they'll give you everything they have." Emma found herself wondering if Thomas was talking about horses in general or speaking from more personal experience. There was something in his voice, a quality of understanding that suggested he knew what it felt like to be hurt and have to learn to trust again. That evening, she watched from the kitchen window as Thomas sat on his cabin porch with his guitar, playing the soft melodies that had become part of the ranch's nighttime soundtrack. Thunder stood at the fence of his paddock, closer than ever before, his head turned toward the music in obvious enjoyment. "They're healing each other," she said softly, not realizing she'd spoken aloud until her father looked up from his newspaper. "What's that?" "Thomas and Thunder. They're healing each other. It's not just horse training. It's something deeper than that." Samuel nodded thoughtfully. "Healing's a two-way street. Sometimes the best thing for a wounded soul is to help heal someone else." Emma continued to watch as Thomas finished his song and stood up to say goodnight to Thunder. The horse extended his neck toward Thomas, and this time Thomas reached out to touch his muzzle. The gesture was gentle, unhurried, full of the kind of trust that only comes from patience and understanding. In the morning, she knew, they would continue their careful work of rebuilding what had been broken. But tonight, in the Montana darkness with stars beginning to appear overhead, it looked like they had found something worth preserving. The third week brought rain, the kind of steady Montana downpour that turned dirt roads into rivers and made outdoor work nearly impossible. Emma found herself watching from the kitchen window as Thomas continued his daily visits to Thunder despite the weather. His figure bent against the wind as he made his way across the muddy yard. Most horse trainers would have suspended training during such conditions, but Thomas seemed to view the storm as another opportunity to build trust. She watched him lead Thunder into the large covered arena where they could work, protected from the elements. Through the rain-streaked glass, she could see their silhouettes moving together in what had become an increasingly synchronized dance. "He doesn't quit, does he?" her father observed, joining her at the window with his morning coffee. "No, he doesn't, but I'm starting to think quitting isn't something he knows how to do." Samuel was quiet for a moment, studying the distant figures in the arena. "Jake told me something interesting yesterday. He said the horse is starting to show signs of protectiveness toward Thomas. Not just tolerance or acceptance, actual protective behavior. Emma had noticed it too. When anyone except Thomas approached Thunder's paddock, the horse positioned himself in a way that kept Thomas between him and the newcomer. It was subtle behavior, but unmistakable to anyone who knew horses well. "That's unusual, isn't it?" she asked. "Very. Most horses are naturally self-preserving. They'll bond with humans, but they don't usually put themselves at risk to protect them. What Thunder's doing suggests a deeper level of connection." As if summoned by their conversation, Jake appeared in the kitchen doorway, shaking rain from his coat. "Morning, folks. Thought you might want to know. We've got visitors coming up the road." Emma and Samuel moved to the front window, where they could see a convoy of vehicles making their way carefully up the muddy ranch road. 2 trucks and a horse trailer, moving with the cautious pace of people unfamiliar with the terrain. "You expecting anyone?" Samuel asked. "No, but I have a feeling this might be about Thomas," Jake said grimly. "Word gets around in horse circles. People are starting to talk about what he's accomplished with Thunder." They watched as the convoy pulled into the ranch yard, and several men emerged from the vehicles. Even from a distance, Emma could see they were dressed more formally than typical ranch visitors. Clean clothes, expensive boots. The kind of presentation that suggested business rather than neighborly calls. The lead man was tall and broad-shouldered, with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way. He approached the house while his companions remained near their vehicles, surveying the ranch with appraising eyes. Samuel opened the door before the man could knock. "Morning. What can I do for you?" "Samuel Bradshaw? I'm Marcus Reynolds, from Reynolds Ranch down in Wyoming. I understand you have a mountain man here working with a difficult horse." Emma felt her stomach tighten at the way Reynolds said "mountain man," as if the words left a bad taste in his mouth. Samuel's expression remained neutral, but she could see the wariness in his eyes. "Thomas Whitehawk is working with one of our horses, yes. Is there something specific you need?" Reynolds smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Whitehawk sold me a horse 3 years ago. A young stallion he claimed was partially trained. Cost me considerable money in vet bills and damaged equipment before I finally had to sell him off. I heard he was here trying to fix that same horse, and I thought I'd come see how that was working out." The implication was clear. Reynolds didn't believe Thomas could succeed where others had failed, and he'd come to witness that failure personally. Emma found herself bristling at the man's presumptuous attitude. "The horse in question is making excellent progress," Samuel said carefully. "Thomas has been working with him for 3 weeks now. Is that so?" "Well, I'd be interested to see this progress for myself. In my experience, some horses are just too damaged to be of any use." Better to cut your losses than throw good money after bad. It was then that Thomas himself appeared around the corner of the barn, leading Thunder on a loose lead rope. Both man and horse were moving at a relaxed pace, seemingly unbothered by the rain that had driven everyone else indoors. Thunder's head was low and calm, his ears forward in an expression of alert contentment. Reynolds' confident expression faltered slightly when he saw them together. Whatever he'd expected to find, it wasn't this picture of peaceful partnership. Thomas had clearly noticed the visitors, but showed no sign of being intimidated by their presence. He continued his work with Thunder, guiding the horse through a series of exercises that demonstrated not just obedience, but genuine cooperation. Thunder responded to subtle cues, a shift in Thomas's posture, a gentle touch, a quiet word, with the kind of immediate understanding that spoke of deep trust. "I'll be damned," one of Reynolds's companions muttered. "That's the same horse that put Jim Harrison in the hospital?" Reynolds himself remained silent, watching the demonstration with narrowed eyes. Emma could see the conflict in his expression, surprise at what he was witnessing, warring with some deeper resentment toward Thomas. After several minutes of this display, Thomas finally acknowledged their presence. He approached the group with Thunder following calmly at his shoulder. The horse showing no signs of the aggression that had characterized his behavior for so long. "Marcus," Thomas said simply, his voice carrying neither friendliness nor hostility. "Just recognition, Thomas. I heard you were down here trying to clean up another one of your messes." The words were clearly intended to provoke, but Thomas's expression didn't change. Thunder was never a mess. He was a young horse dealing with circumstances he didn't understand. Same as any of us, when we're put in situations we're not prepared for. "Some situations require strength, not understanding," Reynolds replied. "Some animals need to learn their place through discipline. Not coddling." Thunder's ears flicked back at the harsh tone, but he remained calm beside Thomas, clearly trusting his handler to manage the situation. Emma noticed that Thomas's hand had moved to rest lightly on the horse's neck, a gesture of reassurance that Thunder seemed to find comforting. "Discipline without understanding creates fear," Thomas said quietly, "and fear makes any creature dangerous. Thunder's not dangerous anymore because he's not afraid anymore." To demonstrate his point, Thomas stepped away from Thunder and gave him a subtle hand signal. The horse moved several steps to the side, then stopped and turned to face Thomas again, clearly awaiting further instruction. It was a simple exercise, but it demonstrated a level of communication and trust that was undeniable. Reynolds watched this interaction with obvious discomfort, his earlier confidence giving way to something that looked almost like embarrassment. He'd come expecting to witness failure and instead found himself confronted with clear evidence of success. "You got lucky with this one," he said finally. But the words sounded hollow even to him. "Luck had nothing to do with it," Thomas replied. "It took time, patience, and willingness to admit that my first approach was wrong. Thunder deserved better than what I gave him 3 years ago. I'm trying to give him that now." The admission seemed to catch Reynolds off guard. He'd clearly expected defensiveness or anger, not this quiet acknowledgement of past failure coupled with present dedication. Emma found herself impressed not just by Thomas's skill with Thunder, but by his handling of what was obviously a difficult and uncomfortable situation. He wasn't trying to prove anything to Reynolds or justify his methods. He was simply demonstrating the truth of what had been accomplished through patience and understanding. Reynolds and his companions left shortly after, their departure accompanied by muttered conversations that Emma couldn't quite hear. But she could see the effect their visit had on Thomas. As soon as their vehicles disappeared down the road, he seemed to deflate slightly, the careful composure he'd maintained giving way to something that looked like exhaustion. "You handled that well," Samuel said, approaching where Thomas stood with Thunder in the drizzling rain. Thomas shrugged. "Men like Reynolds see the world in terms of winners and losers. They can't understand that sometimes the real victory is in admitting you were wrong and trying to do better." Thunder nudged Thomas gently with his muzzle, as if sensing his human's emotional state and offering comfort. The gesture was so human-like in its empathy that Emma felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. That evening, as the rain continued to fall and the ranch settled into its nighttime rhythms, Emma found herself thinking about what she'd witnessed that day. Thomas's quiet strength in the face of Reynolds' hostility, Thunder's obvious trust and loyalty, the way both man and horse had stood together against criticism and doubt. It occurred to her that she was watching more than horse training unfold. She was witnessing a masterclass in redemption, forgiveness, and the power of second chances. Both Thomas and Thunder had been labeled as failures, written off by people who lacked the patience or understanding to see their true potential. But here, in the protected space of Clearwater Ranch, they were proving that sometimes the things that appear most broken are simply waiting for someone willing to believe in their capacity for healing. The discovery came on a Thursday morning during the 4th week, when Emma was helping Thomas clean Thunder's hooves, a task that would have been impossible just weeks earlier, but now proceeded with calm cooperation from the stallion. Thunder stood patiently, occasionally nuzzling Thomas's shoulder while Emma worked on his back feet. When she noticed something that made her pause, "Thomas," she said carefully, "look at this." She was holding Thunder's left rear hoof, examining the sole with the kind of attention that came from years of ranch life. What she'd found wasn't obvious: a small, raised area of tissue that felt different from the surrounding hoof material. Thomas moved to examine what she'd discovered, his weathered fingers exploring the area with gentle precision. Thunder remained perfectly still, trusting both humans to handle him without causing harm. "That's scar tissue," Thomas said after a moment, his voice carrying a note of something Emma couldn't identify. "Old scar tissue, maybe 3 years old. From what?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his expression growing troubled as he continued to examine Thunder's hoof. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "From a nail. A horseshoe nail that went in wrong." Emma felt her stomach drop. "Thomas, that's from when I tried to shoe him myself," Thomas finished, his words heavy with a weight that seemed to crush the air from his lungs. 3 years ago, up at Devil's Canyon, I was so angry, so determined to break his spirit and make him submit, that I tried to force shoes on him when he wasn't ready. When he fought me, the nail went deep. The implications of this discovery hit Emma like a physical blow. Thunder's aggressive behavior, his fear of restraint, his violent reactions to any attempt at control. It all made terrible sense now. He hadn't been naturally difficult or inherently vicious. He'd been in pain. For 3 years, he'd been carrying the constant reminder of Thomas's mistake, a sharp ache that flared with every step. "Dear God," Emma breathed. "He's been hurting this whole time." Thomas had gone completely still, his face pale beneath his weathered tan. Thunder, sensing the change in atmosphere, turned his head to look at both humans with concerned curiosity. "I did this to him," Thomas said, and his voice carried a devastation that made Emma's heart ache. "All this time I thought he was just difficult, just willful. But he was trying to tell us he was hurt, and nobody listened. I didn't listen." Emma watched as Thomas's hands began to shake slightly, the discovery rewriting everything he thought he understood about his relationship with Thunder. The horse had trusted him enough to let him examine the source of his pain, had forgiven him for an injury that Thomas himself had inflicted years earlier. "We need to call the veterinarian," Emma said gently. "Dr. Morrison can—" "No." Thomas's voice was sharp, then softened as he seemed to catch himself. Yes, we'll call the vet. But first, I need to tell your father what I've done. He deserves to know the full truth before he decides whether to let me continue working with Thunder." They walked back to the house in silence, Thunder following without a lead rope, his trust in Thomas apparently unshaken by what they'd discovered. Emma found herself marveling at the horse's capacity for forgiveness, his willingness to maintain faith in someone who had caused him years of pain. Samuel was in his office reviewing feed orders when they knocked. His expression shifted from mild curiosity to deep concern as he saw their faces. "What's happened?" he asked immediately. Thomas told the story in the same quiet, straightforward manner he used for everything else, but Emma could hear the self-recrimination underlying every word. He explained how he'd found Thunder as a 3-year-old Mustang, how his grief over Sarah's death had made him impatient and harsh in his training methods, how a moment of anger had led to an injury that had shaped Thunder's behavior for years. "So you see," Thomas concluded, "everything Thunder did, all the aggression, all the fear, it was because of something I did to him. He was trying to protect himself from more pain, and everyone who handled him after that paid the price for my mistake." Samuel was quiet for a long time after Thomas finished speaking. Through the office window, they could see Thunder grazing peacefully in the paddock, showing no signs of the discomfort he must have been experiencing. "Dr. Morrison is coming out this afternoon to look at some of the other horses," Samuel said finally. "I'll ask him to examine Thunder's hoof while he's here. In the meantime, I want you to continue working with him exactly as you have been." Thomas's head snapped up, surprise clear in his pale eyes. "Sir, you heard me. Nothing changes about your arrangement here. But I caused this. I'm responsible for years of his suffering, for the problems he's had with other handlers. How can you trust me to—" "Because," Samuel interrupted gently, "Thunder trusts you. Despite everything, despite the pain you caused him, he chose to trust you again. That tells me everything I need to know about both of you." Emma felt tears prick her eyes at her father's words. She watched Thomas struggle to process this unexpected forgiveness, his face cycling through disbelief, gratitude, and a kind of wonder that suggested he'd forgotten what it felt like to be given a second chance by another human being. Dr. Morrison arrived that afternoon with his usual efficient cheerfulness, but his demeanor grew serious as he examined Thunder's hoof. The horse stood quietly for the examination, showing the same trust he'd developed with Thomas and Emma. "This is definitely from an improperly placed nail," Dr. Morrison confirmed after a thorough examination. "The good news is that it's old enough that surgical removal isn't necessary. The scar tissue has formed around it, and removing it now would cause more trauma than leaving it alone." "Can anything be done for his comfort?" Thomas asked, his voice tight with concern. "Actually, yes. We can trim the hoof to relieve pressure on that area, and I can prescribe a topical treatment that should reduce any residual inflammation. With proper care, he should be much more comfortable within a few weeks." The relief on Thomas's face was palpable. Emma watched as he gently stroked Thunder's neck, the horse leaning into the touch with obvious pleasure. "There's something else," Dr. Morrison added, studying Thunder's overall condition with professional interest. "This horse is in remarkable physical condition for an animal that's been dealing with chronic pain. His muscle tone, his coat condition, his general health, it all suggests he's been under excellent care despite his discomfort." Thomas looked puzzled. "But I only started working with him a month ago." "No, I mean before that. Someone has been taking very good care of this horse for a long time. The kind of care that goes beyond basic feeding and shelter. Someone who understood his needs, even if they couldn't address the specific source of his pain." Emma saw understanding dawn in her father's eyes first, then in her own. The careful nutrition, the gentle handling, the patient attempts to work with Thunder despite his difficult behavior, all of it pointed to someone who had genuinely cared about the horse's welfare. Even when conventional training methods failed. "Jake," Samuel said softly. Jake knew. He might not have known about the nail, but he knew Thunder was hurting. That's why he never pushed harder with the training, why he made sure Thunder had the best feed, the most comfortable stall. Dr. Morrison nodded approvingly. Whoever it was showed real wisdom. Forcing an animal in pain to perform is not only cruel, it's counterproductive. This horse has been protected from that kind of treatment, which is probably why his spirit remained intact, despite his physical discomfort. As the veterinarian packed up his equipment and prepared to leave, Thomas stood quietly beside Thunder, his hand resting on the horse's neck in what had become their characteristic pose of mutual comfort. "I need to thank Jake," Thomas said finally. "He's been protecting Thunder all this time, keeping him safe until someone could figure out how to help him properly." Emma nodded, understanding now why Jake had been so willing to step back and let Thomas take over Thunder's training. It hadn't been about admitting defeat, it had been about recognizing that Thomas brought something to the situation that Jake couldn't provide, the specific knowledge of Thunder's history and the personal commitment to making amends for past mistakes. The real question now, Samuel said, is what happens after the 30 days are up, because it seems to me that this partnership is just getting started. Thomas looked at Thunder, then at Samuel and Emma, his expression cycling through possibilities and hopes he'd clearly been afraid to acknowledge even to himself. That depends, he said carefully, on whether Thunder wants to stay and whether you're willing to have both of us. Thunder chose that moment to nicker softly and nuzzle Thomas's shoulder, as if offering his own opinion on the matter. Emma found herself smiling despite the emotional intensity of the day's discoveries. Sometimes, she reflected, the most important truths came not from what people said, but from what animals chose to do when they thought no one was watching closely enough to interpret their meaning. Thunder had made his choice clear. The question now was whether the humans in his life were wise enough to honor it. The news traveled faster than Thomas had expected. By the end of the week, 3 more horse owners had called the ranch, asking about his availability for training difficult animals. Word in the horse community moved at the speed of desperation. When someone found a way to reach the unreachable, that information became precious currency among those who'd given up hope. Emma watched Thomas field these requests with obvious discomfort. He was polite but non-committal, explaining that he was still working with Thunder and wasn't ready to take on additional projects. She could see the conflict in his face, the recognition that he might have found a calling that could sustain him financially, warring with his reluctance to leave the security of what he and Thunder had built together. "You're scared," she said one evening as they stood by Thunder's paddock, watching the horse graze in the golden light of sunset. Thomas glanced at her, surprised by her directness. "Of what?" "Of succeeding, of people expecting things from you that you're not sure you can deliver." He was quiet for so long that Emma wondered if she'd overstepped some boundary. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old fears and older disappointments. "Sarah used to say I had a gift with horses. Used to tell me I could help animals that nobody else could reach. But after she died, after I made such a mess of things with Thunder the first time, I stopped believing that was true." Emma studied his profile in the fading light, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into harsh weather, but also the gentleness in his expression as he watched Thunder move through his evening routine. "Maybe the gift was never about being perfect," she suggested. "Maybe it was about being willing to keep trying even after you fail." Thunder had wandered over to the fence where they stood, drawn by their voices, or perhaps simply by habit. He stretched his neck toward Thomas, who reached out to stroke the horse's muzzle with the automatic affection that had developed between them. "The 30 days are almost up," Thomas said quietly. "Your father will expect me to make some kind of decision about what comes next." "And what do you want to come next?" Thomas turned to look at her directly, and Emma felt something shift in the air between them. There was a question in his pale eyes, something he seemed to be trying to ask without words. "I want to stay," he said finally. "Not just for Thunder, but—" He stopped, shaking his head as if he'd said too much. "But what?" "But I don't know if I have the right to want that. I've spent so many years alone, Emma, so many years running from anything that felt like responsibility or commitment. What if I disappoint you the way I disappointed Thunder? What if I let your family down the way I let Sarah down?" The raw honesty in his voice made Emma's throat tighten. She could see how much courage it had taken for him to admit these fears, to acknowledge that he wanted something more than the solitary life he'd built in the mountains. "Thomas," she said gently, "you didn't let Sarah down. Grief makes people do things they wouldn't normally do. And you didn't let Thunder down either. You came back to make it right. But what if next time I can't make it right? What if next time the damage is too great to repair?" Emma looked at Thunder, who was standing quietly between them, as if he understood the importance of their conversation. The horse that had once been too dangerous to handle was now serving as a bridge between two people trying to figure out if they could trust each other with something precious and fragile. "Then we'll figure it out together," she said. "That's what people do when they care about each other. They help each other through the hard parts." Thomas stared at her for a long moment, and Emma could see him struggling with concepts that seemed foreign to his experience. The idea of partnership, of shared responsibility, of being allowed to fail without being abandoned. These were luxuries he'd forgotten existed. "I don't know how to be part of a family anymore," he admitted. "I don't know how to be anything except alone." "Neither does Thunder," Emma pointed out. "But he's learning." As if to prove her point, Thunder moved closer to Thomas and rested his head against the man's shoulder in a gesture of complete trust. Thomas closed his eyes and leaned into the contact, and Emma could see some of the tension leave his body. "There's something else," Thomas said after a moment. "Marcus Reynolds called your father yesterday. He wants to buy Thunder." Emma felt her stomach drop. "What?" "Apparently word has gotten out about Thunder's improvement, and Reynolds sees an opportunity to reclaim what he considers his investment. He's offering twice what your father paid for Thunder, plus a premium for the training." "And what did Dad say?" "He said the decision wasn't his to make, that Thunder belongs to whoever Thunder chooses to belong to." Emma felt a surge of pride in her father's wisdom, followed immediately by anxiety about what this might mean. "Reynolds can't force the issue, can he? Thunder isn't his property anymore." "No, but he can make things difficult. He's got connections throughout the horse community, influence with buyers and sellers. If he decides to make trouble for your father's operation—" "Dad's dealt with difficult people before," Emma interrupted. "He won't be intimidated by Reynolds. I know that. But I also know that my presence here has already caused problems for your family. Maybe it would be better if I took Thunder and disappeared back into the mountains before this gets worse." Emma turned to face him fully, struck by the familiar pattern in his words. "You're doing it again," she said. "Running away when things get complicated." Thomas's jaw tightened. "I'm trying to protect people I care about. By abandoning them? By taking away their right to choose what risks they're willing to accept?" The words hung between them like a challenge. Emma could see that her directness had hit something deep, something that Thomas had been avoiding examining too closely. "Sarah used to say the same thing," he said quietly. "She said I had a habit of making decisions for other people, of deciding what they could and couldn't handle." Smart woman. She was. She also used to say that love without trust is just fear wearing a prettier dress. Emma felt her breath catch at the word love, but she forced herself to stay focused on the larger issue. "So what are you going to do? Trust us to handle whatever comes, or decide we're not strong enough and run away to protect us from ourselves?" Before Thomas could answer, the sound of approaching vehicles interrupted their conversation. Emma turned to see a convoy of trucks and trailers making their way up the ranch road. More vehicles than she'd ever seen arrive at once, moving with the kind of purposeful organization that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. "What in the world?" she began. But Thomas had gone rigid beside her. "That's Reynolds," he said grimly. "And he's brought reinforcements." As the convoy drew closer, Emma could see that Thomas was right. Reynolds' distinctive silver pickup was leading a group that included what looked like livestock transport, vehicles and several men who had the bearing of professional horse handlers. "He's not here to negotiate," Thomas said, his voice tight with understanding. "He's here to take Thunder." Emma felt panic rise in her chest. "He can't do that. Thunder isn't his property. Legal ownership and practical possession are two different things," Thomas replied. "If he can get Thunder loaded onto one of those trailers, sorting out the legalities becomes a lot more complicated." Thunder had sensed the change in atmosphere and was moving restlessly in his paddock. His ears pricked toward the approaching vehicles with obvious concern. Emma could see the tension building in his posture, the return of the wariness that had characterized his earlier behavior. "We need to get him somewhere safe," Emma said. "Where?" Reynolds knows this ranch, knows all the buildings and paddocks. There's nowhere to hide him here. Emma looked toward the house, where lights were coming on, as her father became aware of the unusual activity in the ranch yard. Jake was emerging from the bunkhouse, and she could see several of the ranch hands moving toward the main area with the purposeful alertness of men who sense trouble. "Then we don't hide him," Emma said, her voice growing stronger as a plan began to form in her mind. "We prove that he can't be taken." Thomas looked at her with confusion. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we show Reynolds and everyone else that Thunder isn't property that can be bought and sold. We show them that he's a partner who chooses his own destiny." Understanding dawned in Thomas's eyes, followed quickly by concern. "Emma, that would require... It would require you to trust Thunder completely," Emma finished. "And it would require him to trust you the same way, in front of witnesses under pressure, with everything at stake." Thunder had moved to the fence closest to where they stood, clearly agitated by the approaching vehicles, but still seeking comfort in their presence. Emma could see the intelligence in his dark eyes, the awareness that something significant was happening. "Are you willing to take that risk?" she asked Thomas quietly. "Are you willing to bet everything on what you and Thunder have built together?" Thomas looked from Emma to Thunder, then toward the convoy that was now pulling into the ranch yard with the ominous precision of a military operation. When he turned back to Emma, his expression had changed from uncertainty to resolve. "Get Sarah's saddle," he said quietly, "and tell your father to call everyone he can think of who might want to witness what's about to happen. If Reynolds wants to make this a public confrontation, then let's give him more publicity than he bargained for." Emma felt her heart begin to race as she realized what Thomas was proposing. It was audacious, risky, and completely dependent on the bond between a man and a horse that had been built on trust, forgiveness, and the belief that broken things could be made whole again. Thunder nickered softly, as if offering his own agreement to whatever plan was forming. In the distance, car doors were slamming and voices were rising in the kind of aggressive conversation that preceded confrontation. The final test of their partnership was about to begin. The confrontation unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a thunderstorm that had been building all day. Reynolds emerged from his truck with the confident stride of a man who'd brought enough firepower to ensure he got what he came for. Behind him, 6 professional handlers moved with practiced efficiency, unloading ropes, halters, and portable panels designed to create temporary corrals. Samuel met them in the ranch yard, his posture calm but alert. Emma could see Jake and the ranch hands positioning themselves strategically around the area, not confrontational, but clearly ready to defend their territory if necessary. "Marcus," Samuel said evenly, "this is a lot of men for a social call." "Nothing social about this, Samuel. I've come for my horse. The one your mountain man there stole from me 3 years ago and has been illegally training without compensation." Thomas had remained by Thunder's paddock, but Emma could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands had tightened slightly on the fence rails. Thunder stood beside him, alert to the aggressive energy radiating from the newcomers, but showing none of his former explosive reactivity. "Thunder belongs to Clearwater Ranch," Samuel replied calmly. "We bought him legally with proper documentation. If you have a legal claim, you can pursue it through the courts." Reynolds smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Legal proceedings take time, Samuel. Meanwhile, that horse continues to be a liability to everyone around him. I'm offering you a way out of this situation that benefits everyone involved." "Everyone except Thunder," Emma said, stepping forward before she could stop herself. "And everyone except the man who spent a month healing the damage that you and others caused by trying to break him instead of understanding him." Reynolds's cold gaze shifted to her, and she felt the full weight of his contempt. "Miss Bradshaw, isn't it? You're Samuel's daughter, the one who never married, never left the ranch. I can understand how a lonely woman might romanticize this situation, but business is business." The casual cruelty of his words hit Emma like a physical blow, but before she could respond, Thomas's voice cut through the tension. The horse stays where he is. Thomas had moved away from the paddock fence and was walking toward the group with the kind of measured pace that suggested controlled violence. Thunder followed him without a lead rope, the stallion's ears pinned back as he read the aggressive postures of the strangers who had invaded his territory. "Ah, the mountain man speaks," Reynolds said mockingly. "Tell me, Whitehawk, how does it feel to know that your negligence 3 years ago created the very problem you're now trying to solve? How many people got hurt because you were too proud to admit you couldn't handle a simple training job?" Emma saw Thomas flinch as if he'd been struck, but his pace never faltered. Thunder moved closer to his side, the horse's protective instincts clearly activated by the threat he sensed in Reynolds's voice. "You're right," Thomas said quietly. "I made mistakes with Thunder 3 years ago, mistakes that caused him pain and created problems for everyone who tried to work with him afterward. But that's exactly why he stays with me now. He's my responsibility to fix. Your responsibility?" Reynolds laughed harshly. "You forfeited any claim to responsibility when you sold him off rather than dealing with the consequences of your failure." The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke from a fire that was spreading beyond control. Emma could see other ranch hands gathering at the edges of the confrontation, drawn by the raised voices and the obvious tension. Even some of the neighboring ranchers had appeared, word having traveled with the mysterious speed that characterized rural communities when conflict was brewing. "Thunder isn't anyone's property," Emma said, her voice carrying with surprising strength across the ranch yard. "He's a living being with his own will, his own choices, and he's already made his choice clear." To emphasize her point, she gestured toward where Thunder stood beside Thomas, the horse's posture relaxed despite the surrounding tension. It was a stark contrast to the aggressive energy radiating from Reynolds and his men. "Horses don't make choices," Reynolds said dismissively. "They respond to authority and discipline. That animal needs to learn his place, and the man who can teach him that lesson is worth more than romantic sentiment." It was then that Thomas made the decision that would define everything that followed. Emma watched as he turned toward Sarah's saddle, which she had retrieved and placed on the fence rail as he'd requested. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as he lifted the worn leather and approached Thunder. "If you want to take Thunder," Thomas said, his voice carrying clearly across the ranch yard, "you'll have to prove he wants to go with you, because I'm about to prove that he chooses to stay." The challenge was unmistakable, and Emma felt her heart begin to race as she realized what Thomas was proposing. He was going to ride Thunder, not in the safety of a private training session, but here, now, in front of witnesses who included the very man whose harsh treatment had contributed to Thunder's original trauma. Reynolds's expression shifted from confident mockery to something approaching concern. "You're bluffing. That horse hasn't been ridden in 3 years. No sane man would attempt it in front of a crowd." Thomas was already placing the saddle on Thunder's back, his movements calm and unhurried, despite the pressure of multiple pairs of eyes watching his every action. Thunder stood perfectly still, accepting the familiar weight of Sarah's blessed saddle, with the trust he'd learned to place in Thomas's judgment. "Sanity," Thomas said quietly, "is overrated when you're trying to prove a point about love and loyalty." The words carried across the ranch yard with the kind of quiet authority that made everyone present understand. They were witnessing something significant. This wasn't just about one man and one horse. This was about the fundamental question of whether trust could triumph over force, whether healing was stronger than breaking, whether love was more powerful than fear. The moment Thomas swung into Sarah's saddle, the entire ranch seemed to hold its breath. Thunder stood perfectly still, his ears pricked forward with alert attention, but showing none of the explosive resistance that everyone expected. The absence of violence was somehow more dramatic than any bucking or rearing could have been. Emma felt tears prick her eyes as she watched Thomas settle into the saddle with the careful grace of someone who understood that this moment was about more than horsemanship. It was about trust made visible. Forgiveness given form, redemption demonstrated through the simple act of two beings choosing to move together rather than apart. Easy. Thunder, Thomas murmured, his voice carrying the same gentle cadence he'd used during all their quiet conversations over the past month. Just like we practiced. Just like Sarah taught us both. Thunder's response was to turn his head slightly, as if checking that Thomas was secure, then begin to walk forward with the calm confidence of a horse who trusted his rider completely. The crowd that had gathered, ranch hands, neighboring farmers, Reynolds and his men, watched in stunned silence as the allegedly dangerous stallion moved with fluid grace around the ranch yard. Reynolds's confident expression had been replaced by something approaching disbelief. "This proves nothing," he called out, but his voice lacked its earlier authority. "Anyone can sit on a horse that's standing still. Let's see what happens when that animal remembers who he really is." As if summoned by Reynolds's words, a commotion erupted near the barn. One of Reynolds' handlers, apparently deciding to take matters into his own hands, had moved to open the gate of the paddock where several of the ranch's other horses were contained. The sudden movement and the crash of the metal gate against the fence sent the confined animals into a panic. The effect on Thunder was immediate and dramatic. His head shot up, his muscles tensed, and Emma could see the familiar signs of the fight-or-flight response that had characterized his behavior for so long. This was the moment Reynolds had been waiting for, the return of the dangerous, unpredictable behavior that would justify his claim that Thunder was too volatile to remain with Thomas. But Thomas didn't dismount. He didn't try to control Thunder through force or restraint. Instead, he began to sing. The melody that rose from his throat was the same crow lullaby he'd used during Thunder's first encounter with the saddle. But now it carried a depth of meaning that seemed to reach every person present. The ancient words spoke of partnership between human and animal, of trust earned rather than demanded, of strength found in gentleness rather than domination. Thunder's ears flicked toward the sound of Thomas's voice, and gradually, incredibly, his tension began to ease. The panicked horses in the nearby paddock were still moving frantically, but Thunder seemed to find an island of calm in the storm of chaos around him. "That's it," Thomas said softly, his voice blending with the melody. "We don't have to be afraid anymore. We don't have to fight everything that threatens us. We can choose to be peaceful in the middle of the storm." Emma realized that Thomas wasn't just talking to Thunder, he was talking to himself, reminding both of them that they had learned to find strength in vulnerability, power in trust, safety in the choice to remain open despite the risk of being hurt again. Thunder began to move again, this time at a slow trot that demonstrated not just obedience, but active cooperation. Thomas guided him through a series of gentle turns and transitions, each movement flowing seamlessly into the next, with the kind of harmony that could only exist between partners who trusted each other completely. The demonstration was beautiful, but it was also a clear statement about the nature of the relationship between Thomas and Thunder. This wasn't domination disguised as partnership. This was genuine cooperation between two beings who had chosen to heal each other rather than perpetuate the cycle of fear and violence that had defined their earlier interaction. Reynolds's frustration was becoming increasingly obvious. "Fine," he said loudly. "You've proven you can ride him in controlled conditions. But what happens when something goes wrong? What happens when that animal reverts to his true nature?" As if the universe had decided to test the strength of what Thomas and Thunder had built together, a sudden gust of wind caught one of the portable panels that Reynolds's men had unloaded, sending it tumbling across the ranch yard with a tremendous crash. The metallic clanging was exactly the kind of sudden loud noise that would have sent the old Thunder into a frenzy of fear and aggression. Thunder shied slightly, his muscles bunching with instinctive alarm. For a moment, Emma could see the ghost of his former self in his posture, the wild-eyed panic, the readiness to explode into violence as a means of self-protection. But Thomas remained calm in the saddle, his voice continuing its gentle stream of reassurance, his hands steady on the reins but not restrictive. It's just noise, Thunder. Just the wind moving things around. Nothing that can hurt us. Nothing we need to fight. And Thunder, remarkably, chose to believe him. The stallion's ears flicked toward Thomas's voice. His breathing gradually slowed, and instead of exploding into the violent display that everyone expected, he simply stood still until the wind died down and the ranch yard returned to relative quiet. The silence that followed was profound. Everyone present had witnessed something that challenged their understanding of what was possible between human and animal, predator and prey, fear and trust. Emma could see the exact moment when Reynolds realized he had lost more than just a legal battle over ownership. He had lost the moral authority to claim that force and dominance were superior to patience and understanding. Thomas and Thunder had proven that healing was stronger than hurting, that trust was more powerful than fear, and that sometimes the most broken things could become the most beautiful when given the chance to heal in the presence of genuine love. 6 months later, Emma stood at the same kitchen window where this story had begun, watching Thomas work with a nervous mare that had arrived the previous week. The horse, a beautiful paint with trust issues, stemming from rough handling, was making the same tentative steps toward healing that Thunder had taken. All those months ago, Thunder himself grazed peacefully in the main pasture, his dark coat gleaming with health and contentment. The limp that had plagued him for 3 years was barely noticeable now, thanks to Dr. Morrison's treatment and Thomas's patient care. More importantly, the wariness that had defined his interactions with the world had been replaced by a calm confidence that made him a favorite among visitors to the ranch. The Clearwater ranch had changed in ways both subtle and profound since Thomas's arrival. What had started as a 30-day trial had evolved into a partnership that benefited everyone involved. Thomas's reputation as a trainer who could reach difficult horses had grown steadily, bringing clients from across the region who were willing to pay premium rates for his particular blend of patience and understanding. But the most significant change, Emma reflected, had been in Thomas himself. The man who had arrived 6 months ago carrying the weight of isolation and self-doubt had gradually transformed into someone who seemed comfortable with belonging, with being needed, with allowing himself to be cared for by others. "Deep thoughts?" Thomas asked, appearing in the kitchen doorway with hay in his hair and the tired satisfaction of someone who'd spent the morning doing meaningful work. "Just thinking about how different everything looks now," Emma replied, not moving from her position at the window. Thomas joined her there, close enough that she could smell the familiar scent of horses and leather that seemed to cling to him permanently. "Better different or worse different?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Better. Definitely better." She turned to face him, noting how the lines around his eyes had softened, how the rigid set of his shoulders had relaxed. "You look like you're sleeping better." "I am. Turns out having a reason to get up in the morning makes the nights more restful." Through the window, they could see Samuel walking toward the barn with Jake, the two men deep in conversation about some aspect of ranch operations. At 63, Samuel moved with renewed energy, clearly energized by the expansion of their training program and the positive reputation it was bringing to Clearwater Ranch. "Dad's been happier too," Emma observed. "Having you and Thunder here has given him a new sense of purpose. He talks about the ranch's future now instead of just maintaining what we have." Thomas nodded, his gaze following Samuel's progress across the yard. "He offered to make me a full partner yesterday. Not just an employee or contractor, but an actual partner in the operation." Emma felt her heart skip. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I needed to discuss it with you first." The implication of those words hung between them like a bridge spanning the distance between possibility and certainty. Emma had sensed the growing connection between herself and Thomas over the past months, but neither of them had spoken directly about what it might mean for their future. "And what is it you want to discuss?" she asked quietly. Thomas was silent for a moment, his weathered hands clasping and unclasping as if he were trying to find the right words for something important. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the same gentle honesty that had characterized all his interactions with Thunder. "I want to discuss whether you think a woman like you could be happy with a man like me, someone who's spent most of his adult life alone, who's still learning how to be part of something bigger than himself, who comes with more baggage than most people would consider reasonable." Emma studied his profile, noting the vulnerability in his expression, the hope he was trying not to show too clearly. "What kind of baggage are we talking about?" "The kind that includes a cabin in the mountains that needs work, a past that includes mistakes I'm still learning from, and a future that I'd like to build with someone who understands that healing is a lifelong process, not a destination you reach and then stop working toward." Emma felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "That doesn't sound like baggage, Thomas. That sounds like honesty." He turned to face her fully then, his pale eyes searching her face for signs of the judgment or rejection he'd clearly learned to expect from life. "There's something else. Something I need you to understand before you make any decisions about us." "What?" "I loved Sarah. Deeply, completely, in the way that only happens once in a lifetime for most people. She shaped who I became, and her loss nearly destroyed me. I'll always carry that with me." Emma nodded, understanding the importance of what he was telling her. "I wouldn't want you to forget her, Thomas. She made you who you are, and who you are is someone worth loving." The words seemed to hit him like a physical force. His eyes widened slightly, and she could see him processing the idea that love didn't have to be possessive or exclusive, that honoring the past didn't preclude embracing the future. "I love you," he said simply, as if the words had been waiting inside him for permission to be spoken. "I love your strength, your wisdom, your willingness to see the best in broken things. I love the way you challenged me to stop running, the way you believed in Thunder and me when we didn't believe in ourselves." Emma reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the lines that mapped his journey from isolation to belonging. "I love you too. All of you, the mistakes, the healing, the man who sings lullabies to frightened horses and thinks that makes him weak instead of strong." They kissed then, standing in the kitchen, where Emma had first watched Thomas approach Thunder's corral, with nothing but patience and hope. Through the window, Thunder lifted his head from his grazing to look toward the house, as if he sensed the completion of something that had begun with his own journey toward trust. A year later, when Thomas and Emma were married in a ceremony held in the ranch's main pasture, with Thunder serving as an unofficial witness, the weathered leather bridle that had hung on the corral fence during those first tentative days was incorporated into Emma's bouquet. It seemed fitting that something which had once represented restraint and control should be transformed into a symbol of partnership and choice. Thunder, wearing a garland of wildflowers around his neck, stood quietly throughout the ceremony, his presence a living reminder that some bonds transcend species, that healing is always possible, and that the most beautiful partnerships are built not on dominance or submission, but on mutual trust, respect, and the courage to remain open to love despite the risk of loss. Sometimes the most broken things are just waiting for someone to see their worth. And sometimes, when that recognition finally comes, it creates something more beautiful than anyone could have imagined possible.